So how long have you known Ariel Dorfman?
I first met Ariel as a graduate student when I started studying at Duke in 1989. And I studied with him the entire time I was a grad student. He also directed my dissertation, so I'd known him for a while. It wasn't until after I had already started my first job that I thought, wow, I might be in a good place to write a book about him. And it was in some ways a difficult choice, because other people had said to me things like, don't write on living writers. They'll keep writing and they'll prove all your theories wrong. Or if you write on a living writer, you'll end up never being able to finish your book. And then other people said things like, don't write on writers whose work you really like, because you'll be too emotionally invested in it and you won't be able to take critical distance. So in some ways it felt like deciding to write the book was breaking all of those pieces of advice. But in another sense, it seemed like a great idea, because a lot of what I learned about how to be a literary scholar, I learned while I was studying with him. So having been in his classes, working with him as a teaching assistant, seeing how he wanted to teach literature to other people, not his own writing, but other writing, like 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, taught me a lot about how he thinks about literature in ways that I thought hadn't been as obvious as some of the critical writings that had been published. So it felt like I had special insider information that would make the book, and would add something to the book project.
Are there any of his works in particular that made you feel I absolutely have to work on this project?
It's interesting, because some of the works of Ariel's that I like the best have been the less popular ones. Obviously, Death and the Maiden is without question his most well-known work, and I like most people, think it's an absolutely incredibly engaging work. But I love his really long, complex novels that include footnotes and 7 different storylines and are a combination of postmodern and Baroque. And those are not exactly the texts that people tend to love, because they're very they're dense. So what is interesting about Ariel as a writer, what kind of started the book project itself, was that the 2 works that are most well known of his are Death and the Maiden and How to Read Donald Duck, which is related to the Empire's Old Clothes, right? That kind of writing, that popular cultural criticism that's kind of fun and that's incredibly insightful, but it has a silly side to it sometimes too. And so those 2 works seem really, really different. How to Read Donald Duck, Death and the Maiden, they don't even seem like they were written by the same person. And then if you factor in the other kinds of writing that I mentioned, the really dense, complex novels, it doesn't make sense that that's all coming from the same writer. And so part of my project was, okay, how do I make sense of this? How do I say there's not a consistent style, but there's a consistent aesthetic? And that was at the heart of kind of the book project. It's hard to say, but probably the work that most got to me, and still is a work which I can go back to and get a lot from, is La Santa Manuel Sendero. There's other books and texts that have come out that I think are in the same kind of mode, and that I also love, like The Nanny and the Iceberg. But I'd still say that I have a real fondness for Manuel Sendero. The question of whether or not Dorfman has a particular mode that he's especially good at is a really excellent question, because actually he's had huge success in poetry, in theater, in the novel, in cultural criticism, in the short story, and yet not all of his novels, not all of his poetry, not all of his short stories are equally fantastic, right? I mean, there are times when some of the, just as it is with most writers, some of those texts are better than others, right? They're more successful, or they're more engaging. One of the things about Dorfman's writing that I think can be challenging is that he tends to want to provoke his reader and kind of take the reader out of that comfort zone. And sometimes that provocation is incredibly effective. Sometimes it just pisses off the reader, right? So there's that kind of subtle game between getting to the edge of that. And I've noticed it in reviews where reviewers that had really enjoyed one work would read a novel like Blake's Therapy and not understand it. And say, I don't know what this novel is about. This bothers me. And so that was the other project that was behind my book, which was, this is really curious, right? Because people go to a Dorfman book and they think, I really enjoyed this novel, and they pick up another novel. Let's say they really enjoyed Confidence, and then they pick up Blake's Therapy thinking, oh yeah, I like this writer, and they get a completely different book. Like the kind of mode of writing, the type of characters, the dilemmas seem so completely different. And so part of what I talked about was, why would a writer do that? And I think, what Dorfman is actually doing in these moments is he's saying, this story needs this kind of form. And so instead of being a writer who already has a form ahead of time, he says, no, this story requires a storytelling mode that looks like this. And so he lets it come out like that. So one of the things that's unusual is, again, that combination between noir writing and Baroque writing and theater of the absurd, kind of spare writing. That's a really odd thing in a writer, and in a writer with the kind of extraordinary international visibility that Dorfman has, right? If you pick up a novel by Garcia Marquez, you don't know maybe what the story's completely about, but you're not going to be surprised at the way he uses metaphors or how he constructs his characters, or right? Because there's kind of a mode that you're used to, and that's how Garcia Marquez tells stories. Dorfman's not like that. And his stories start with problems. He comes back to the same kinds of social problems, the social crises, that's what gets him going. And so each form will be varied.
So Dorfman's read this book, right?
Yes.
And how did he react?
The biggest moment for me was when Dorfman read the chapter where I kind of elaborate on his aesthetic theory, and I say, well, he doesn't have this consistent style, but there are these very particular things, especially like at the level of sentence structure, or just at the level of kind of ongoing, recurrent themes and motifs that you can find in almost every work. And when he read the chapter, he said, okay, this, he gave me comments on it, he said, okay, I'm going to pretend I've never seen this, because I don't know if I can. He's like, you're right about this, and I never knew I was doing it, and I don't want to think about it anymore. Even little things like his interest in, why would he starts sentences all the time with conjunctions, like little specific writing style things that he didn't even notice that he was really doing, right? So then he was like, okay, I don't want to ever think about this. I won't be able to, write without having your voice in my head. So that was the best moment, especially as a student, because I always talk about how I teach my own graduate students that when I was a student of Dorfman's, early on, he really gave me a hard time on my writing. He said, you could do better. This isn't that good. You need to work harder. So, there's something about having that professor who was the toughest on me be the one who's like, wow, you really saw something I didn't even know I'd seen in my own work. It's kind of probably the best part of that process for me. One of the things that I really hope the book will do is inspire more people to work on Dorfman. What I did in part was try to gather materials and put things in the same place, especially with the timeline of his life and the full bibliography of his work, and obviously with the analysis that I offer that I hoped would make it easier for future scholars to kind of take what I'd done and run with it, right? Part of the reason why working on Dorfman is difficult is because some texts are originally written in Spanish, some are originally written in English, some when they go from English into Spanish change, and I felt like I was in a pretty unique position to put all that information in one spot. And partially too because of my connection to him, I would read manuscripts before they got published and I could see how they changed, and so one of the goals there is exactly to hopefully make it possible for future scholars to feel like they have a really good resource that they can use as a guide.